bowling ball going back and forth in a line from you to me.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another video in my Apollo Moon Hoax series. I'm so happy once again, to have Marcus Allen back, the most knowledgeable person on this subject I've ever spoken to. Hello, Marcus.
Hi, Randy. Good to be with you again. There's always so much to talk about.
Always. This is a never-ending subject, and as we were just saying before the before the recording, you know, you bring up one point and it can lead down so many other rabbit holes in this subject. It's actually a very fascinating subject to talk about because it tends to encompass a lot of other subjects as well. So Marcus, Marcus needs no introduction. Everybody should know who Marcus Allen is by now, but we're going to be focusing today on Marcus' book, the Apollo Moon Hoax, The Real Evidence, by Marcus Allen, co-written with Trevor Weaver.
That's right. Yep.
And we've actually covered some ground on this in a previous video, so this is going to be for part two. But what I've sort of rearranged a little bit. I want to go back to the beginning. There's a couple of points that I would like to cover. And so for those of you watching out there, we don't have visuals. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be describing everything. And I picked points that we could really talk about that really don't need to be followed up with visuals. And there are many references, though, in Marcus Allen's and Trevor Weaver's book that they will direct you to when they've numbered it in terms of apps, and they'll direct you to that in the book. So we're going to be going back to chapter 1 because there's a couple of points that I missed earlier, and I'd like to bring that up again with Marcus. So Marcus, what I'm going to do is I'll just read the quotes that I've highlighted from your book, and then maybe you can expand on that a little bit more. How does that sound?
That sounds good. Yeah, let's go for that.
Okay, so let's start with chapter 1. And I always find this particular point fascinating because so many people, so many proponents use this point as a justification for validating the Apollo moon mission. So let me read the quote to the reader. Quote, a common so-called proof of the moon landings offered by the pro-NASA group relates to the number of people who apparently worked on Project Apollo for NASA or one of its contractors. It is often stated in phrases such as, over 400,000 people were involved in Project Apollo in one way or another. How can the conspiracy theorists imagine that the secret about the hoax would not have been revealed in more than 50 years? And I hear that argument all the time from people, and you always have a very good response to that. So if you could elaborate on that.
Well, certainly. It's something I've heard about for many years because it's one of those apparently definitive proofs against Apollo being faked. And I'll say right from the beginning, Apollo never landed humans on the lunar surface. But 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program, either in NASA or the contractors around the place. And the contractors around the United States would include Boeing up in Seattle in Washington State, top left-hand corner of America, for those who are not there. They make aeroplanes as well, and they made the lunar rover in conjunction with General Motors, because General Motors make cars, so they make it, but Boeing were making it. And then you come down to California, where you've got the Rocketdyne, you've got Lockheed, you've got all the other contractors who were employed by NASA to build the various pieces of equipment required to get humans onto the moon, they thought. Then you go down to Texas, where you've got the control center known as Houston, because that's where it was. And of course, that was it's now, I believe it's now named the Lyndon Baines Johnson's Space Center or something like that, because he was the guy who provided all the money for it, because he was senator for Texas. So let's not say that money isn't involved. And then you come up to Florida, where the launch site is. And then you go up to New York, where you've got the Grumman Aircraft Company making the lunar landers. And you go across to Connecticut, where you've got the companies making the spacesuits, International Latex Corporation, otherwise known as Playtex. They were making the spacesuits because they were used to building or making things which would flex as human body moved. You go across to Illinois, where you've got other companies. They're right across America. One of the original ideas behind Apollo was to spread the money across the country. And I think we just demonstrated that the major contractors did it. Now, these major contractors, they're big companies. They employ a lot of people. Not all of them were working on Apollo, but 400,000 of them apparently were working for Apollo. That's the figure that is generally agreed as being the number who were working on the Apollo program in the mid to late 1960s. Probably the most were working on it in 1965. That's where the most money was spent. Now, in addition to those 400,000 people, you've got their families, you've got their friends, you've got the direct relations with them, and they would almost certainly have known that their friend, their father, their brother, their cousin, their uncle was working on Apollo because it was a proud thing to be doing. This was honoring the now dead President John Kennedy's challenge to land humans on the moon. So I would put the figure near at 2 million rather than 400,000 who knew what was going on. Because all these people had families, whether they were married or not. They had mothers, fathers, uncles, brothers, cousins, all the rest of it. So a large number of people in America were aware of what was going on. And that was quite normal. This was to be expected. And they, as the rest of the world did, watched the launch of Apollo 11 on July the 16th, 1969. We all watched it. And we're told 650 million people watched that launch and watched the Apollo 11 activities over the next 8 days. So the idea that 400,000 people could keep a secret is such complete and utter nonsense. It hardly bears discussing, but I think we should discuss it because it's such a theory produced by so many people, and there are people like, get this, Professor Anu Ojha, director of the UK National Space Academy, director of the National Space Centre in the UK. Quote, "How could so many people keep a secret?" Unquote. Then you've got the UK Institute of Physics making a similar comment. Then you've got Dr. Laura Danley, the curator of the Griffith Observatory in California. And you've got Ruth Langsford, who is a TV presenter on the independent television in the UK, who says, personally, for me, I just think far too many people would have had to have covered it up for so many years to never have slipped up. USA Today make a similar comment. Rick Feinberg, the press officer of the American Astronomical Society, who says about 400,000 scientists, engineers, technologists, machinists, electricians worked on the Apollo program. That's true. In fact, if in fact the main motivation for believing in the moon hoax is you don't trust the government, you don't trust our leaders, you don't trust authority, how can you feel that 400,000 people would keep their mouths shut for 50 years? It's just implausible. No, it's not. They didn't have to keep their mouths shut. This is the whole point. They didn't have to keep their mouths shut because they had no secret to keep. They were doing the very best job they could. And I think it's an insult to claim that they were working to hoax the Apollo program. They weren't doing that. They were watching it. They were doing the best job. They worked long hours. Their lives were upended in some cases by the number of hours they worked on the Apollo program. So the idea that they were keeping some sort of dark secret is just so much nonsense. It's fiction. Forget it. It doesn't work. And if anybody can prove that I'm wrong when I say that, I want to hear about it, because nobody has yet shown that that is the case, that 400,000 people kept a secret. No, they didn't. It's called compartmentalization. That's how you keep secrets in the military. You know enough to do your own job and nothing more. It's a standard military procedure. That wasn't applied in Apollo. There was cooperation. There were a lot of people desperately trying to work out how the hell we were going to get humans onto the lunar surface. The truth is, they didn't get humans onto the lunar surface because they couldn't. There was no conspiracy about it. It was just engineering. It was just the conditions in space are so grotesque for humans. We're not designed to be in space, us humans. We're designed to be here on Earth under the atmospheric pressure we live at, with bodies designed to work under those conditions. We're not designed to work in a vacuum, which is what space is. So if anybody was going to blow the whistle, an English expression for let the cat out of the bag, all the rest of it, they might have done it, but they wanted to see the success of the Apollo missions, as we all did at the time. We were all caught up in this hoopla and this PR and this Disneyfication of space, because that's what it was. Oh, by the way, Stanley Kubrick had nothing to do with it. He was far too busy making his masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey. So forget Kubrick being involved. He wasn't.
Interesting, because that's what a lot of people will actually come back and use that and say, when you say Stanley Kubrick's involved and there's no proof of that, well, he wasn't involved, and that solves that problem right there. Well, you know, when you were talking there, I was thinking about whistleblowers, and you mentioned that just a few minutes ago, and the argument has been, well, you know, people higher up within the organization of NASA, higher up in the management, never came forward. Somebody surely would have come forward and blown the whistle. But what a lot of people don't seem to understand, Marcus, and I'm sure you would agree, is that these whistleblowers would never get anywhere near the likes of CNN or Fox News to reveal a story. If they did, it would never be aired. I mean, because the mainstream media was part and parcel to the cover up and charade that was going on here. And when I hear, you know, whistleblowers coming forward, having said that, when somebody does come forward, like Bill Casey came forward and disclosed what he saw while he was working within the program from 1958 to 1963, and he got ridiculed and mocked for decades. And then you have the other argument where they will say, well, the Soviets, if the Soviets knew about this, and they knew about it, they would have come forward. Well, no, they wouldn't. And the thing is that when a Russian scientist does come forward, which we'll discuss soon, to disclose the Apollo moon hoax through their knowledge and their scientific research, they're ridiculed as being, oh, well, he doesn't really exist. These are not real scientists. So you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So my argument is to the people who want to ridicule the whistleblowers, are you telling all of us that you actually need confirmation from politicians who actually lie all the time? That's what their careers are based on, lying to the public. And you're waiting for them to validate. You're waiting for a Russian politician, Vladimir Putin, to validate the Apollo moon landings. That says a lot about your mentality out there for the people who say that constantly, right? So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Good point you make there. And you mentioned the Russians, or the Soviets as they were known then, the Soviet Union. And that's one of the other ideas put forward by people who say, well, if it was fake, the Russians would have blown the whistle. They would have exposed America for faking it, without looking into the politics behind that. Because if Russia did know, and it's pretty certain now that they were fully aware of the problems, they may not have known them at the time, but they know them now. it's far more profitable for the Soviet Union to shut up about it and blackmail America than it is to expose them, because once you've exposed them, you've lost your leverage. You can't have an effect if you've exposed it. I mean, that's how blackmail works. Maybe it's an unpleasant word, is blackmail, but that's what was going on. The Soviet Union were desperate. Now, there's a point about the Soviet Union. They have one major export commodity, natural gas. They're sitting on it. There are huge gas fields in the Soviet Union, mainly in Siberia. Before Apollo 8, the Soviet Union entered a contract, signed contracts with West Germany, as it was then, Hungary, Italy, and Austria to export their natural gas into those markets so they would gain foreign currency income, because the future of the Soviet Union was at stake. They just fought World War II. This is less than 20 years after the end, or just over 20 years after the end of World War II, where Russia lost 30 million people. They were devastated. Their industry was devastated. The Soviet hierarchy were desperate for some way in which they could benefit from their own natural gas, so they sold it into Europe. We've seen in recent years the effect of cutting off the supply of Russian natural gas, and it's basically decimated the German economy because Germany were relying on it. Now, these contracts to supply the export of Russian natural gas was signed in September 1968, just before, a few months before, Apollo 8 took off. That was December 1968. The idea that America were fooling the world by launching these 3 astronauts who read from the book of Genesis, and they orbited the moon, Apollo 8. They didn't land, they orbited the moon because they had been spooked by the Russian, was it Luna 15? I think it was.
Yeah.
Which was basically an unmanned craft, but it had a tape recorder on board which could be activated from Russia, where they started a commentary as if there was astronauts on board the craft. Russia's very good at chess.
Yeah.
So they fooled America into thinking that they had sent humans, Soviet Union, cosmonauts, to orbit the moon just prior to Apollo 8. So America got thoroughly spooked by this and decided they would have to do it as well. So they sent Apollo 8 up. But Apollo 8, the rocket, the Saturn V rocket, had never been tested with humans on board, let alone going to the moon. And they hadn't tested the heat shield to come back with. You need a heat shield to slow down, remove the energy of the re-entry of the command module into Earth's atmosphere. It's only 60 miles up, so it's you've got to get it right, or you'll crash into the Earth and go splat, and you're a pancake. You're coming back at 25,000 miles an hour. They hadn't tested that. They didn't know they could do it. It was a huge risk for America to do that. But Russia didn't call them out on it. They congratulated them and said, well done, guys. I think that was more a sarcastic commentary than it was real. But Russia, the Soviet Union, were not about to expose America. It was in their interests to maintain the idea that America had succeeded in doing what they claimed to have done. The fact that they didn't succeed in anything they claimed to do in landing humans on the moon, look at the trouble they're having getting back 50 years later. Oh dear, oh dear. I mean, it's sad. Well, it would be sad if it wasn't so funny. I think it's very funny because they're being exposed gradually. There's a gradual exposure of the fraud of Apollo. So the Soviet Union knew perfectly well what was going on. They had enough technology to be able to identify. And being clever, the Russians used Jodrell Bank in the UK, a big radio telescope in the UK, to listen in to the Soviet landers or the Soviet craft going to the moon, and they were reporting it. So that was considered to be an honest report, which it was. They reported what the Soviet Union were doing. It was a very clever move, that, because you can't then turn around and say, well, Jodrell Bank are in on it too. No, Jodrell Bank were totally independent. And they were working with the full knowledge of the British and the American governments to track the Soviet craft. Clever move, that. Again, chess players.
Very interesting. And one of the points you just made caught my ear. I won't get into this too much because I'd like to move on to the next chapter. But before we do, you mentioned the Apollo 8. They were spooked basically into that fictitious manned mission. And when you talked about the lack of testing, which is something I focus on a lot in my first book, you reminded me there was only 4, if I'm not mistaken, there was only 4 actual testing of the heat shield in actual conditions for the command module. I forget the name, the designation of the 2 missions, but there was the first 2 missions, then there was Apollo 4 and Apollo 6. And 3 out of those testing are questionable. Apollo 4, maybe in terms just of the heat shield. Now, I'm not talking about the engines, which we'll get into in a moment, but just in terms of the heat shield, the data is questionable. So very, very, when you think about that, they put a crew on board Apollo 8 after 4 missions to test the heat shield in actual conditions with questionable data, and you can look that up. I've talked about it in my second book, and I've sourced that material. It really does give more credibility to when you say the NASA was spooked into putting a fictitious crew on Apollo 8. So that really certainly does add up. Well, that's a good introduction, folks, to chapter 1 of Marcus Allen's book here. And I'm going to go into chapter 2 now. Now, we did discuss chapter 2 and 4 quite in depth in part 1. So please refer back to part 1 for any more. For those of you who haven't seen this, you can catch up on that. But there's one point that I would like to talk to Marcus about here. And that is chapter 2, Marcus, page 25.
Okay.
And it's the second paragraph, and I'm going to read it out loud.
Okay.
And because this particular paragraph really encompasses a lot in terms of the whole chapter, chapter 2. So the quote is this: the question is, could the simulations have been realistic enough to convince the general public and the mission controllers? The best evidence we have is from the people who were involved at the time. For example, the words of the Apollo 11 flight director, Gene Kranz, also flight director for every odd number Apollo mission. And his quote is this, and this is what I found fascinating. Quote from Gene Kranz: the simulations were so real that no controller could discern the difference between the training and the real mission, unquote.
I think that says it all, don't you?
Doesn't it? I mean, it really does.
Yeah.
I mean, it really does. I mean, that particular quote really helped me a lot when I was writing book 3, when I wrote a fiction account, that is. And I was really able to expand on that. And it really got my imagination going, just reading that quote alone. I mean, that is a very, very telling statement. And Gene Kranz, of course, was as you mentioned, I think he was the director of, was he director also Apollo 13, right?
He was on Apollo 13. Yeah.
Yeah, the odd number ones. Yeah. So I mean
11. He was on Apollo 11, 13, 15, and 17.
So he's actually, by doing that, he's actually, it surprises me that, just to just to discuss it just for a couple of minutes, and we'll move on. It surprises me that he would say something like that, especially, and I believe that quote came out fairly recently, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if it was like 15 or so years ago.
Yeah, quite.
And for him to say that, knowing the controversy that's now surrounding the Apollo missions and the growing percentage of people who now believe that the Apollo missions were faked, for him to come out and say that is almost like he's validating everything we've been saying.
I think it is. I think that's quite right. Maybe he's probably. I mean, I don't even know if Gene Kranz is still alive. Maybe he's died recently. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe, I'm sure somebody will tell us. If his conscience was getting a little bit close to him, that he now knew that he was participating in a fraud on the American public, and his conscience wouldn't allow him to continue with that. So he had to come up with this form of words. It's a very interesting form of words he uses. They couldn't tell the difference between a simulated mission and a real mission, implying the missions were real, but they couldn't tell that they were real because they were using simulation. It was using what's called the Tetra A satellite, testing and training satellite, which was launched in, I think it was 1967, to which transmission could be directed. It was orbiting the moon. Transmission could be directed to it and then returned, so it appears to come from space. So the people working on the simulations, which they were then in 67, because every mission was simulated in real time. Apollo 11, 8 days, there was an 8-day simulation. So they knew who was going to be on duty in the Houston Control Center, because once the rocket had cleared the tower, all communication came from Houston, not from Florida. Florida was just there to launch the damn thing. Houston was controlling it. So you've got this position where they're controlling something they can't see. They're relying on television screens producing information. They don't know where it's coming from. And that was one of the points raised in the famous film Capricorn 1. Yeah. It's coming from the wrong place. That's where the reporter got the idea that there was something going on, and he was dismissed. From space, you can tell where something is coming from. It's called the Doppler effect, if you've got the right equipment to record it. Now, whether they had the right equipment or not is debatable. Not everybody in Houston, in the control center, would know that there was a problem. They were just looking at their television screens and reacting to that because the whole thing had been set up. I think there were the newly developed IBM 360 computer series, and Houston was one of the first people to use them. Now, those computers were very good, very powerful. They were used by newsrooms because, if you get film and you have it in a computer, you can press a button and that film shows and all the rest of it. So you can control it. Now, very few people would have known who was in charge, who was controlling it. The flight controllers wouldn't have known. They might have suspected it. But why would they think that they were being lied to? They had no reason to believe they were being lied to. Very few people would know about it. And that is one of the reasons why the capsule communicator, or Capcom, as he was called, was always an astronaut. He was not one of Houston's people. He was an astronaut. He was one of NASA's people. Because only an astronaut, the reason given was only an astronaut would know what was going on and would understand it. Mm-hmm. It was a reasonable thing to say. But also, if the astronauts were involved in the fraud, in the fakery of Apollo, they had to keep the picture correct for everybody else. So that they were basically the gatekeepers of the story. Not the technicians on their computers, not the people creating everything. These are the 400,000 people who worked on Apollo. They knew nothing about any of this. Only the astronauts would know, and a few of the senior people at NASA itself. And we have the mystery of why James Webb, after whom the telescope is now named, the James Webb Space Telescope, who was head of NASA for 7 years and resigned around the time of Apollo 8. Why? He brought the whole thing forward and he resigned. I think it was October. The landing was December, or the orbit of Apollo 8 was December. Why would James Webb, a highly respected individual in NASA, who had spent 7 years building the whole point up, resign just before it came off? Makes no sense.
It makes no sense. And I've heard some proponents put forward the theory, because it is a theory. I haven't seen any evidence that, well, his contract was up and that was normal, but I don't think so. If you're the director of NASA about to launch the greatest scientific achievement of mankind, you certainly want to be there to take credit for it.
Yeah,
Contract or no contract, you definitely would negotiate that into your contract.